who am I when I am unmasked and unfiltered? So that's why we talk about, working with marginalized parts, of course, because those are things that prevent my full authentic expression. So often in the coaching world, we don't talk about authenticity so much as the full range of my authentic expression. And range is key because the idea is parts of my range are hidden in the shadow. So I got to kind of find a way to connect with those parts. And often the parts that are hidden there are not, some are painful, but some of them are resourceful. And that's the key. Coaching is interested in helping the client become more aware of the resourcefulness. But I think as a result, the more one unmasks, the more one might actually begin to trigger a response in someone that is still masked or filtered to some degree. That provokes them into or activates a part of their authenticity that's still hidden in the shadow that might actually, you might say it's a bit like an application booting up on a desktop. So they might behave awkwardly in the face of authenticity.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. I'm a psychiatrist, and I study meaningful coincidences. And one of the multiple aspects of dealing with coincidences are the interpersonal elements of them, because there's so much involved with our own lives and interpersonally. And our guest today is Nick Kettles, who, among other things, studies self-awareness and projection.
Mm-hmm.
Self-awareness and projection.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these are two complex psychological ideas. Nick's a coach. I'll read about more details of him. But this concept of being self-aware, that means aware of what's going on in your own mind, and monitoring it, which I call self-observing, and so a lot of other people do. A self-observer is in your mind that can notice projections. That term projection seems to have emerged from the days when there were movie projectors, and that film would go through a projector, and a light would shine through the projector film and onto a screen. That's a really good image of what we're talking about here, is that we have ideas about other people, and they go through this movie theater light in the film of our ideas, and they get projected onto the screen of the other person's face and body, and then we act as if that person is what we are projecting onto them. This is what goes on in our reality all the time. And we need to do projecting because this is a way for us to understand other people based on our own experience. So it comes from a very positive place, but it also gets really distorted. And those of us who are leaders, people project all kinds of mothers and fathers and siblings and archetypes on us leaders. You got to okay, where am I in the midst of all this becomes a real question. So we're going to get into some of that with Nick today, as that's part of his coaching. Because it's an essential part of understanding and owning your own projections, because they're often parts of yourself that you have denied, repressed, tried to ignore. And so they come out, and then if you look at what you've projected, you get to know more about your internal workings and become more individuated. So, Nick, that's my intro. What do you think of that intro? Then I'll introduce you.
Well, I loved it. Thank you. It's just a small responses that when I'm training, coaching, people say, well, how many people do you train? And I say, well, usually it's a class of 20, but I said there's usually 60 people in the room, which means the 20 individuals plus all of their mothers and fathers. So I totally understand what you mean about the projections that happen. When you're in a figure of authority, people do often project, mother or father onto you. That's just how it goes, and we can't help it, and we need it to be able to see ourselves clearly. We
Yeah.
can't self-observe our own mind sometimes without projecting. So I love your characterization of it and that it's healthy. to some degree.
And when it isn't healthy, that's right.
Yeah.
It's only healthy,
Yeah.
I'm thinking,
Yeah.
when you are able to say, uh-oh, I think I'm distorting my view of the other person.
Agreed.
And
Agreed.
that's this self-observer thing. And part of what I'm doing these days, Nick, is trying to focus on not only individual self-observer, the one that you have, the one I have to observe our
Mhm.
own minds, but I want to be able to help develop a collective self-observer, a
No, it's
collective
beautiful.
self-observer, because we
Yeah.
have a collective mind of which we are all a part.
Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll get into that a little bit more, but meanwhile, back at the ranch, or Nick's in France, back in France, I'll introduce Nick to us. Nick is a master certified coach who is known for his compassion, keen insight, and fierce commitment to creative and personal transformation. Nick has been working in the field of personal and professional development for over 25 years, and today works as a leadership coach, course facilitator, training design consultant, and mindfulness teacher. In his work, he supports executives, leaders, entrepreneurs, and innovators, helping them navigate uncertainty and complexity. Uncertainty and complexity. That's what we got plenty of these days. From a
Mm.
foundation of deep self acceptance and authorship. I mean, the idea of being able to recognize your own capability of making stuff happen, to
Yeah.
widen that, your
Essentially,
own,
exactly that. Yeah. Yeah.
that authorship of the movie of your life.
Yeah. We might call it agency, but authorship is the same from my view. Yeah.
I like agency
Yeah.
too.
Me.
Hey, I need an agent for this movie I'm running. Well, that's you. Okay.
Right there.
Often this calls us to embrace parts of ourselves which we have marginalized into the shadow, ooh, into the shadow. The archetypes that Nick and our mutual friend Ricky are very much involved with.
Yeah.
Understanding the archetypes that we are indirectly talking about here, that we call up from our subconscious, unconscious, and project onto other people. Nick skillfully guides and with compassion and full permission, and I think a lot of humor, and making this stuff happen. So, Nick, welcome to Connecting with Coincidence.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for reading my LinkedIn bio with such lightness. I feel like to hear it played back. It says that sounds very LinkedIn, but it pretty much sums up what I do. So thank you.
You're welcome, and it's what you gave me, so I let it out there.
Yeah.
You give me something else, I would have put it out there.
It's all
I think
good. I'm happy with it.
you're happy with it. Well, I added a few little things too, so it's nice to have it. Uh,
Thank you.
you're welcome. And as we both recognize, part of the coaching, or which is and its cousin,
Mhm.
coincidences,
Yeah,
involve cousin psychotherapy
yeah,
involves coincidences.
absolutely.
Not all the time, but they're there. And when I'm talking about the collective self-observer, I'm talking about recognizing collective synchronicities as well. But that's for another time.
Yeah.
You have been tuned in to a lot of things interpersonally, and more than that, collective unconsciously by focusing on archetypes. But
Mhm.
tell us about a good, meaningful coincidence in your life, one that was life transforming.
Yeah, thank you. I've been a student of coincidence since my early 20s, meaning like I observe them and sometimes proactively kind of try to provoke them. It's kind of like an ongoing experiment so it's been fun part of my life and part of my spiritual practice. But the best, I think, synchronicities, of course, are the ones you're not looking for because they kind of like slam you in the face and like, whoa, you feel woven into the kind of tapestry of life and you can't ignore them. And the one I want to share is one such that is just like that. Essentially, what was happening is my partner and I, my who is now my wife, our children were small. They were 5 and 2 at the time, and we had decided to move from the UK. somewhere else. And we got down to a short list of two places, Scotland and France. And there were two locations that we had identified, and we loved them both. We had visited both. But we made a call on France and the location in France where we now live because, frankly, it was warmer. I love Scotland, but it's cold. So there you go.
It was
And
Fin
my family,
it was Findhorn in Scotland that you were
yeah, it was
thinking about.
spent on in Scotland. There's a spiritual community there, which is very well known and worth looking into. But yeah, it's cold, and where we live in the southwest of France is near the mountains, which is just beautiful. And I have Scottish ancestry, so they don't take it. That part of me doesn't take it personally. So anyway, so we come to Pau in the southwest of France, and our kids are small, so we enroll them in a kindergarten. And at that time, I'm previously worked as a meditation teacher and a rebirther, but my career is really around journalism and marketing. That's my trade. It's where I make my money. I come with an intention to set up a career as a marketing consultant. We put our kids into a kindergarten straight away, and the kindergarten assign a family to kind of look after us, like a welcome committee. And the husband of the family, the father of these two kids in the school, happens to be a coach and works for the training company that I still work for 17 years later. So I'd never heard of coaching when I came to France. I didn't know what it was. 2005, I meet him and I see that he has something that I don't have, some facility with language, some emotional intelligence, relationship intelligence, agility. And I've been involved in growth and therapy for about 10 years. I'm like, wow, I want some of that. That because that was agency as far as I could see, and it's not a place I'd touched. And I was like, so he gave me some coaching sessions, and eventually I ended up working for the company he worked for, trained as a coach, and ended up being hired as part of their faculty. So that's not the coincidence. The coincidence is 6 years after meeting him, having subsequently joined the faculty of the company he works for, I'm at a retreat with other faculty members in America, and I meet this other faculty member, and we get chatting, and he said, "Oh, I said, where did you?" They were from Asia, and he said, "Oh, I'd lived in Europe." I said, "Where did you live?" He said, "Oh, I lived in the UK." I said, "So where did you live in the UK?" And he said, "I lived in Scotland." And I said, "Where did you live in Scotland?" And he said, "I lived in Findhorn." And I was like, "When did you live there?" And it was the exact date when we moved to Pau in southwest France. And I got goosebumps in that moment because I realized, wow, it didn't matter whether I went to southwest France or Findhorn. There's a very high chance I was going to find this coaching model from either of them. It's like the university said, let's spread our bets. let's make sure this guy, me, meets one of these two. So, and I really thought, of course, we'd made the right decision to go to Pau in southwest France. But so that for me was the coincidence, was like this realization. It really probably didn't matter which way we went, Pau or Findhorn. And it still feels very meaningful to me because it affirms the certainty of the path that I decided to take, you know, and that's where I feel coincidences are most powerful, is where they really affirm a choice that you're making, if you actually listen to them. So,
Yes, affirmation of choices is probably the most common use of meaningful coincidences.
yeah,
Just it's like you get a pat on the back that says
you made the right
you're
choice.
and that's what you got.
Yeah,
And the the guy from Asia showed up at Findhorn at the same time you went to France.
yeah.
Uh, that there's something, I don't know, magical or let me use your term, archetypal about that.
Yeah, I don't see the archetypal pattern that you see, but um for me it affirmed both my choice, but it also affirmed my a part of my spiritual practice, which is about surrender. It's like surrender is kind of a paradox. It's not about being passive. It's about committing fully to your choice and then letting go of attachment of the outcome. So it really affirmed that too, you
Would
know.
you repeat that, please? Because I think it's so important what you just said.
For me, to the best of my ability, I'm sometimes not good at it, but I try to practice the process of surrender. And a lot of people will interpret the notion of surrender or non-attachment through engaging with a more passive approach to life. It's kind of like negating the world, rejecting the world, or not wanting to be assertive. But for me, surrender is being fully assertive about the choice you make. Back your choice and then let go of the outcome. That's
What's hard about that?
What's hard about it, I think it's one or the other. It's actually having conviction in one's choices. That's what coaching does a lot. It's really about looking at, first of all, agency. Where am I resourceful, and I have inner resources that I can mobilize in service of the change I want to see happen in my life. But knowing what those resources is only half the story. The next piece is, capacity to make the choice, which requires some level of discernment and clarity about the reasons why I'm making the choice. And that's for me where conviction comes from. So one's got to do that first, and then one's got to surrender to the outcome. It's like we talk sometimes in coaching about this idea of act with full permission, but take full responsibility for your impact. That's also about non-attachment as well, because you have to not try and control the outcome. If you are too attached to the outcome, then you might get in your own way.
True, that's very true. You probably will. And
Mm.
unfortunately, the human mind is such that if I commit to something, doing something, that means I start with an outcome I have in mind. It's it's inevitable, um, right or not?
Well, 100%, and I think increasingly, if we you mentioned you highlighted the piece about uncertainty and complexity in my bio, and a lot of people talk about that in the corporate world, leadership world. Our job is to learn how to navigate it, and what they think is my job is to learn how to control it. And actually, the outcome is the opposite. It's to learn how to be vulnerable in the face of complexity and uncertainty. And that doesn't mean being passive. It means acting based on the best information I have with conviction, and knowing that I may not have full control over the outcome, you know. Um, I think passivity is an issue for us in the world today. You know, a lot of us are afraid of strength as an idea because they think of strength as abuse, strength as aggression, strength as um, some notion of toxic masculinity, for example. And yet one can be strong and still non-attached at the same time. I think that paradox is perfectly possible for people. So, wow.
It's perfectly possible, but difficult. And
Yeah.
that's and I'm trying to suggest where the difficulty comes from so that you want to make a commitment. Like I'm committed now. Been committed to synchronicity for like a long time. But now using it as a lever or a lever to a lever to help influence the direction humanity is going by showing us how coincidences demonstrate our interconnectedness with each other and with our environment and more. But I have to also not like have an outcome in mind. And one of the troubles I've got now is what is the vision that
Yeah.
I have and other people have to see what it is for what we would like humanity to become,
Yeah. Yeah.
not what's
Well, I think
wrong. Go
I think you're at the
ahead.
heart of like the most existential question we have is about, what does it mean to be in the journey? I mean, I'm not a Jungian analyst, although I've done a Jungian-based postgrad. But one thing I think I read about Jung was when he was talking about individuation, is he said frankly, he said, I don't know if I'm individuated yet, which is quite a humbling thing to say. He's like in his last part of his life, and he's effectively saying the process of individuation is not an outcome. It's a journey. it's an ongoing process of becoming. I mean, there's lots of philosophical schools of thought. I think Heidegger was interested in the notion of becoming, being and becoming, and many spiritual schools of thought talk about that too. So but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a vision. I mean, there's the paradox. It's like have the vision, launch it out there and go for it, but be open to seeing how it evolves. And there's some language in the leadership development community that I really like. It comes for people listening, if they're interested in looking up further, it comes from the work of a man called Otto Scharmer, who's at MIT in America. And his body of work is called Theory U. It's quite complex. It's a
It's
management science,
it's
but
it's
it's
called what? It's called what?
theory U, like the letter
Theory U.
U.
Okay.
Yeah, and the U refers to effectively like the shape of the letter U is mirrors the process that we take when we go in much deeper into our self process. We hit kind of a critical point of integration where the outside starts to mirror the inside. And he says at that point, one becomes attuned to what he calls, and I'm sure maybe some listener will correct me if I've misquoted him, but it's like we become attuned to what is called the emergent future. It's this notion that the future is emergent. It's kind of like we're in a dialogue with the future, if you like. We're co-creating it. So one can't be too attached to the canvas that they want to paint, but one needs to have a sense of, which colors they want to use, at least to get some paint on the canvas and begin the process. But listen to the feedback. You know, if you start painting red and the emergent future says, actually, it's green and purple, don't keep painting red. Listen to the feedback process. So I think it's interesting because I'm fascinated about that world because it speaks very powerfully to the world of coincidences, which I think is that has always interested me because I think that also reveals the implicit dialogue that we have with life, which I think a lot of us are afraid to countenance as a reality, that there is a causal relationship between this inner world and this outer manifestation of the collective mind. And I think some people are interested in coincidences. Maybe you see this or not. They're interested in coincidences, but they don't want to look further than just noticing them. They may go, oh, that's a coincidence, and they won't interrogate it further what it means. But if they did, they might find that actually it reveals there's a level of interdependence and interconnectivity that we can barely see, you know? So
Yes, I know. And uh, that's so amazingly wonderful to hear from you that a management guy gets to the bottom of the U, which
yeah,
is a metaphor already, the
yeah,
bottom of the U,
yeah.
you, and in there the U begins to recognize the external reflects the internal, and the internal reflects the external.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's thrilling to think that there's managers or leaders in corporations that we might, to use your language earlier, project onto as being hopeless, a world of despair and greed. That there's people inside those organizations that are wholly committed to the growth of human consciousness, no different from someone in an ashram in some spiritual community. So, I know that I used to project onto those organizations as the worst thing that happened. They're dinosaurs, and that can't wait for them to fail. But my experiences of working with them is that they're full of people who have great heart, great soul, great desire to grow, to bring back humanity into the organization, to make the organizational purposeful. And of course, they're wrestling with the beast of the bottom line all the time. But the idea that they're all enslaved to it is rubbish. That's not my experience. There's a great movement of, I think, very hopeful movement of trying to figure out a better way of being in relationship with each other inside organizations. And Theory U is one element of that. So it's exciting times.
That's very good to know. I very because I project also with some positivity, but now you're giving me more positivity about the people inside who are battling the bottom line, but also trying to help
Yeah,
us
raise
evolve.
awareness. Yeah, to raise awareness. Oh, without exception, there are still corporations that deserve those projections. They're accurate, but some, but not all. So,
Okay, well, I'm looking for people who are self-aware and can
Mm.
understand something about interpersonal connection, that we are not alone. We are both solo selves and deeply connected to what's around us. And
Yeah.
so that people in management are also doing the same. Some of them are doing the same thing.
Yeah, they look closely at the notion of relationship one to one and one to many. You'll hear language inside leadership development or organizational development, for example, such as identifying the system as like an entity. When I mean an entity, I don't mean like from some horror film, but that it's a collective identity. Uh, so they talk about, the culture of a company has its own kind of energetic field. You will hear that kind of
Oh,
language, and they
good,
will
good, good.
say that this energetic field has its shadow, it has its hidden voices, it has its biases, but it also has its identity and the desire to create kind of like a collective culture that is more conscious is very alive inside a lot of organizations, including government and non-profit as well. So, but again, it's not reflective of the whole for sure.
It's not.
The beast of the bottom line wins out often, but that doesn't mean people are completely, surrendered to that.
It's we're all like partials of
Yeah,
something in various
yeah, yeah,
degrees.
yeah,
Uh, at least you're sending out the hope to
yeah,
me. And
yeah,
all I'm doing is looking for a subset of humanity, all in very different places, who are
yeah,
self-aware and recognize this interconnection with our environment, that our environment mirrors our inner world, which is what fundamental to synchronicity, and use that as a foundation for doing something into the chaos and complexity of where we're going. I don't know. I mean, Finhorn
Uh,
is one way. Anyway, that's another question. But I want to go on to another
yeah.
question for you.
Please.
It's the relationship between authenticity and what I call para-communication.
Hmm.
We strive to be authentic, and I would be interested in your definition. And I will also start with my definition of para-communication.
Please.
Para-communication is parallel communication. It's other we have, it used to also be called meta-communication, but meta-communication is communication about communication
Yeah.
for the most part. Para-communication is the nonverbal element of communication, that nonverbal element of communication, which attempts subconsciously, usually, to induce a role in the listener
Yeah.
that the speaker wants to have
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
listener be in.
Hmm. Hmm. So you want my thoughts on the relationship between those two things?
I want your thoughts on how being authentic
Yeah.
induces a role response in the other person.
Sure. Yeah. Um, well, first of all, my definition of authenticity is really related to one individual's personal sense of free expression. I think it has to be connected to free expression. Who am I when I am unmasked and unfiltered? So that's why we talk about, working with marginalized parts, of course, because those are things that prevent my full authentic expression. So often in the coaching world, we don't talk about authenticity so much as the full range of my authentic expression. And range is key because the idea is parts of my range are hidden in the shadow. So I got to kind of find a way to connect with those parts. And often the parts that are hidden there are not, some are painful, but some of them are resourceful. And that's the key. Coaching is interested in helping the client become more aware of the resourcefulness. But I think as a result, the more one unmasks, the more one might actually begin to trigger a response in someone that is still masked or filtered to some degree that provokes them into or activates a part of their authenticity that's still hidden in the shadow that might actually, you might say it's a bit like an application booting up on a desktop, so they might behave awkwardly in the face of authenticity. That's at least my observation. I don't know if that's what you're pointing to. Please guide me if I'm misreading your.
Oh no, I think there's a contradiction
Yeah.
between authenticity and paracommunication.
Yeah.
Uh, the apparent anyway. I mean, I'm also very interested in polarities and resolving them, which I'm sure you do
Sure. Yeah,
a
of
lot of
course.
stuff with. It's part of the fun of this. It's like thesis, antithesis, synthesis,
Yeah.
however you want to call it. So there's an apparent polarity between being authentic. I'm being real. I'm being myself. But what am I inducing by being authentic as a role response request, not or demand or
Yeah.
manipulation? These are all kinds of ways you can use paracommunication. What is the impact that I'm not aware of having
Yeah. Yeah,
by
I
being
get it. Yeah. 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 Well, I think that's the why it's called the road less traveled. Because sometimes, the unmasking process is uncomfortable, not just for the individual doing it, but for the people that are around them. You know, I don't want you to be truthful about who you are because it makes me feel uncomfortable in who I am. So, as to some extent, the unmasking process or starting to be more honest about one's, full range of one's full authentic expression is a provocation for other people. And that might activate a range of responses from attraction through to repulsion or through to defense. There's a wonderful line in The Matrix, which I just is in one of the videos that our mutual friend Ricky and I made together about the call to adventure, and it's where Neo says to um, no, Morpheus says to Neo, he says, some of these people are not willing to wake up or not ready. They're so inured to this reality that they actually will fight you if you try to wake them up. And I think that's kind of like at a meta level what you're talking about. And I think sometimes we find in the coaching world, people come into coaching, and our model that I work with is a whole person centered. So not dissimilar to humanistic psychology. And it's not just about getting stuff, having more. It's about coming into new relationship with who I am as a resourceful, creative, and whole human being. And often that ignites people. They're very excited about it initially. And then there's a moment of disappointment that comes when they realize that they've changed and the world hasn't changed. And they're starting to see that in the workplace, people are responding differently to them. And I say that if the system, meaning the culture in which they're swimming, is kind of receptive, it will accept them. But sometimes it spits them out, literally. I've met people I've worked with inside organizations that went on a growth journey, really diving in deep, becoming more of who they were open about that in the workplace. And the workplace didn't want to accept them. And so it's a kind of case of like I shut down again or I leave. And so often that's what happens. People leave. So,
Reminds me of the oft-told tale of somebody being in psychotherapy, um, and the marriage falls apart
well, as
because
it
the
probably should. Yeah. Yeah. You say maybe they give the psychotherapists, they say, well, you thought you were going to fix my marriage. And probably inside the psychotherapist head, they'll probably say, well, it looks like we probably have,
Well, that's good. I like that one. I haven't thought of that one. I haven't thought of that one. What I get from being authentic,
Yeah.
which is that my being authentic
Yeah.
induces
Yeah.
a request, not a, I mean, you can't do any more than request in doing this and talking with somebody. You can do demand.
Yeah.
You've got to do, well, uh, adore me, says Donald Trump in various ways, indirectly as well
Yeah.
as directly,
Yeah.
that non-verbally. Authentically, if you're being authentic,
Yeah.
you're in, you're saying, please be authentic with me.
Indeed. Yeah, it is. And it's a disappointment when others are not. And that is also a growth edge, I think, for a lot of people. Talking with Ricky about this, about on the spiritual path, for example, and when people maybe have an awakening of a greater reality and they go and pursue some kind of spiritual practice and they light up and they feel like they need to withdraw from society in order to kind of create some safety around cultivating that light, that awareness. And certainly I went through that period. I want to reject that world that is inauthentic. But there is a process, I think, at some point where you've got to kind of re-enter into that. And because otherwise you won't be able to see your projections clearly. You can't see any of your projections clearly in a retreat center apart from society. You've got to re-engage to see to what extent your growth is sustainable, and fully integrated. So I recognize what you're saying from that context, you know. So
Boy, that's a wonderful message you got there, Nick. That you can't really spiritually grow unless you go out into the world and start seeing the mirrors of your mind out there, which could include some of the projections that you're not able to pay attention to.
yeah, I think, well, I didn't say it. Ram Dass said it. He said, if you want to, this is the Harvard professor, Ram Dass from the late 60s. He said, if you want to see how enlightened you are, go and spend 3 days with your family of origin. So you can maintain your Zen posture then. And it's of a similar ilk, but today for me, I couldn't, I felt I wanted to leave society in order to grow and live on the margins, and it just wasn't sustainable. So I was kind of forced back in to make a living, and it's there I realized actually that's where a lot of growth work happened. I had enough stability in my relationship to self by that time. I needed to retreat. I needed to stabilize a lot of symptoms of anxiety and self-loathing and find some connection to a core. But once I had that, re-entering into society and being in relationship with the, you might say, the friction, of society was really useful because it's providing constant feedback about where you can't see yourself. Again,
Yeah,
only if you're, yeah,
yeah,
you're
only
willing.
if you're willing to do it. And let me underline something you're saying without saying.
Oh, please.
You have to allow yourself to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
I mean, people are so, oh, you said something that really, oh, that's such a terrible thing that you did. How could you do that to me? Oh, you're bad. Is unfortunately rampant in this society, at least the one I'm living in.
It, yeah, it is. And I think we're talking about the pendulum as well. I think, there might be been an over calibration towards insensitivity, for long periods of time. And then we've over calibrated to oversensitivity to some extent. I mean, that's why you sit here. I don't like the term, but the term snowflake was, I think, developed in response to a kind of repulsion at just how oversensitive, how much space we were making for people's minor sensitivities.
Yeah,
And there's a study that I was reading recently that was launched in the UK from a group of psychologists. It was reported on the BBC a few days ago about they're coming to the conclusion that what children need today is resilience. Um, Now, they are acknowledging that this particular generation has been subject to a whole rewiring experiment through social media, which is true to some extent.
it is.
We never anticipated what would happen if you put this in the hand of a 5-year-old that's brain is still very plastic. So we don't know how much that influences their hypersensitivity and sense of feeling anxious and all of the other symptoms that they're manifesting. But the conclusion was is that just band-aiding those symptoms is not enough. We need to consider how do we build incrementally resilience in children, which, at least from my generation, I'm guessing from yours, was part of the package deal of childhood. You know, you you it grew hopefully in a healthy way, through the rough and tumble of, being a child in the world without having access to 24/7 porn and crazy social media or whatever else is on the phones. So I like where
Yeah,
you're looking.
yeah, very good. So we have about 5 minutes left, Nick.
I
Um,
wish it was more. I'm really enjoying the conversation.
thank
I
you.
feel
Thank
like
you
we
very much.
barely touched on the synchronicities, but it's obviously gone where it needs to go. So
Well, I'll pause on that one and get back to you, but it's uh, why don't you tell us about your work with Ricky and archetypes and where people can find um, your YouTube episodes?
Yeah, thank you. Well,
You're
um,
welcome.
Ricky DeRice and I are both, I'm ex-journalist, he's still a practicing journalist, and but we all both have an interest in depth psychology from different approaches and a common passion for Jungian psychology. And we're very kind of, think, disenchanted with the world of journalism today. And we felt like there was not a lot of, especially with, it's both short form media. It's just too short to say anything of substance. And we wanted to take a deeper dive into some ideas. And we came up with this idea that we're interested in archetypes, but we found a lot of the literature about it is very, very generic. It talks about, the archetype in its pure form. Maybe it talks about the shadow of it. Robert Moore's work does that, which is great. But we wanted to say, well, how does that show up in society? So it's like a neo-Jungian approach that says, let's look at how is these shadow expressions playing out for real. So we came up with this idea called decoding the archetype of something in an age of something. So for example, our first video was decoding the magician archetype in an age of misinformation. Because when we think about the magician archetype, we're thinking about Gandalf, for cripe's sake, we're thinking about, Merlin or Harry Potter. And that's so far removed from the reality of how that magician archetype is actually living through human experience in the modern world. So our desire was to create this series where we say, let's have a shot. This is our, we always say it's our opinion. You could disagree if you want. Let's have a shot at decoding. How does the magician archetype really show up? Because it doesn't show up with someone appearing with a magic hat on. It doesn't look anything like that. Our intuition was it shows up in the world of misinformation, sleight of hand. There's one of the links that we make. And so we've created a series based on that theme, where we look at one archetype and we'll see decoding that archetype in an age of something. So another example is decoding the warrior archetype in an age of hate and hyperpolarization. So we look at the warrior as not something like a physical warrior, but a war of minds. How do we use the mind as a sword to defend and to attack? And how does that create the hate and hyperpolarization? So that's the series. We have a lot of fun doing it. It's slow media because we take a lot of time creating them. We only have seven, I think it's 8 videos now. And but we have a strong following, about 5,000 now, and about 100,000 views. And so clearly, although we're not putting out a lot of material when we do, they're about 20 to 25 minutes long. They're well appreciated, and people can find them at Archetypes of Awakening on YouTube. So you just go to YouTube and type in Archetypes of Awakening, and you'll find our channel there. And we hope that you enjoy them. And if you have a request or a suggestion of, a particular archetype you'd like to see us explore, please let us know as well. We'd be happy to add it to the shopping list. So
Wonderful. And the link will also be is also in the bio below this recording. So you could find Archetypes of Awakening link as well there.
yeah.
Uh, Nick, it's been a pleasure talking with you. And yes, we have a few more things we can talk about. And coincidences still could be one of them. So we can talk about having another time to meet if you'd like. I'd like that as well.
Yeah. And maybe it'd be a chance to talk about kind of like the experience of coincidences in a raw form. I wonder if I could take a minute to share one of the early experiments I did in coincidences. Is
Please
that
do. Please do.
maybe it's just a provocation or an invitation to people to try the same. When I kind of fell into my spiritual path because I wasn't planning it, that was another coincidence in the early 90s. Is when I'm in my early 20s, just out of university, I just was into everything: channeled material, psychology, spirituality, vegetarianism, whatever it was. I was just eating it all. And there were so many different things around psychic development that I was interested in. And one of them, I came across this idea called bibliomancy. I was like, what the heck is that? So apparently it was a form of divination that used to exist in the medieval times, where people would hold a question and then open the Bible at random and wherever you looked was the answer. So it's kind of like a idea that there's a synchronous relationship between my mind and the response. So, um, I wasn't, I didn't lean towards Christianity at that time. Certainly, mystic Christianity is part of my work life at the moment, but at the time, I didn't want to use the Bible. So, my friend and I, we used to do crazy things. We say, let's set the video recorder, because this is the early 90s when we had video recorders. Let's set it for a random time in the like at 3 in the morning for some random channel. In we have a question, so we have a question and an intention, then set the video recorder for a random time for a random channel, and then let's see what comes on. And we would always play back the video. It was like 10 minutes we set it for, and it was crazy. There was always something on that video that was just like spookily connected to what we were asking. I mean, it's no different from going to a bookshelf and pulling off a book at random and opening it, and you find, that's what I was looking for. So we had a lot of fun with experiments like that. And you know as well as I do, that's what some people interested in synchronicity have also done, going out and sitting on park benches and counting, incidences of patterns of, you know, um, visual cues that they see. So I'd love to share more about those adventures another time, Bernard.
Good. I'd like to hear them. I've never heard that video one. That's a good one.
We didn't have a
The,
Bible, so we just thought we think, what's the modern day version? It's the TV.
what, Another version is the I Ching.
Yeah, of
The
course,
I
same
Ching
thing.
is a form of bibliomancy as well, a very complicated version. But you using 3 a.m. for a video, I mean, a 10-minute segment, that's new to me. I really like that one because it illustrates the idea yet more clearly. So,
Yeah,
uh,
and it takes it out of the mystical with the I Ching or the tarot card or the Bible. It just says it actually could just manifest in just some random, insignificant trash TV program in the middle of the morning. And I think that's where the fun that I think that opens you to possibility, because you can put the world of divination into some kind of exclusive, mystical, sacred space that detaches us from just observing everyday life, because that's full of coincidences and meaningful links. So, Bernard, I've really enjoyed talking with you. I feel great gratitude for the invitation. Thank you so much.
you're welcome. And thank you
It's
for joining me.
yeah, it's a pleasure to get to know you.